Pastor Josh here, and as we have been in this Thrive series, kicking off our sermons for 22, on the weekend we had Matt and Ken with us talking about how to thrive financially, and we are just so grateful for all the questions that you submitted, and we weren't able to handle them all live in service, and so thanks for joining us on Facebook as well as YouTube for part 2 of our Thriving Financially series. So thanks again, guys, for being with us.
You bet.
It sparked a lot of conversations in the congregation, in the lobby after service, even amongst the staff as we were talking this week, and my home, my wife, my kids, my young adult kids. And so I've picked a few more questions that we're just going to kind of volley around, and I just love what you guys had to say, and we might cover a bit to catch up and then go forward as well. So one of the big threads and themes, as you probably recall, was this idea or concept of budgeting, right? And I think that that's probably that, December to January thing. People are thinking about new salaries, new year, new ways to prioritize their spending and honor God in it, of course. So the question is, what is the best and simplest way to start a budgeting practice if you don't have one?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think kind of right away is start knowing where you're at. Going back, you can go through credit card statements, you can go through your checkbook or online, and just seeing where you're spending money and start totaling that up. I spoke over the weekend just about a few different apps that you can use. So Google, free budget apps, stuff like that, Mint, Personal Capital, again, are two big ones. Dave Ramsey's got one. And you can start tracking what you're at and then kind of see, where you're from that point. But you at least need to know where you're coming from to start.
Yeah, I think those are great points. Another one out there that somebody brought up actually in the congregation is called Trueville. It actually, I've dealt with this one a little bit before. What it does is take like subscriptions that you're subscribed to, and if you don't use them for a certain amount of time, it goes and it cuts off those subscriptions. So say you're subscribed to Netflix, but you haven't logged into Netflix for 6 months, and you can set the parameters on it, and it'll just automatically help you out with your budget that way. So it's another great tool that you can go out and use and go from there. Sure.
Give me some nuts and bolts, all right? People who are on salary, people who are hourly, people who are independent. They, their salaries, their income stream kind of fluctuates. Give us some practicals on how you set a budget kind of categorically that way.
Well, as Matt was mentioning, kind of look at your spending. You got to identify those needs and those wants, really. You're going to have your fixed expenses and then some of your variable expenses. You're probably going to know what your rent or your mortgage is. You're going to know your utility bills, kind of where they range from. Then you're going to have your variable expenses like your food or your spending, like entertainment or whatnot, going out, those type of things. So you want to identify those things and then really start to hone in on some of those things that maybe you can condense down a little bit and reel in to be able to get to a place that you're comfortable in your budget.
Yeah, and if you've got a flexible, salary, maybe you work on commission or maybe it's seasonal and stuff like that, that makes it really difficult to be able to do that, and getting control of that really makes it really important. Knowing what times of the year that number might go up and what times of the year that number might go down, and being able to plan ahead of time so that when you have the good months or the good seasons of your year, that you're able to save extra during that time period, just to make sure that you're ready for those months or seasons that aren't going to be.
Yeah, so go ahead, Ben.
Well, I was just going to say, it's kind of like creating an emergency fund for yourself too, right? Especially if your income fluctuates that much, you definitely want to set up, like Matt said, kind of some savings aside and create that emergency fund just in case your commission that you're expecting doesn't come in and you have the ability to cover those bills for that month or whatnot.
Yeah, so you both mentioned saving, all right? And that's probably the number one thing people who are watching and listening in are wondering. What's the goal? What's the benchmark to begin? Is there a number, a percentage to start the saving process?
Well, as Matt and I were mentioning both over the weekend and right now, starting with that emergency fund, just getting to a point where you can set aside probably 3 to 6 months worth of emergency savings. So that way if you lose a job or you get sick and you don't have paid time off, you can cover those bills. And then what I would also say too is if you have that established, Then you start to look at like a match that you're getting from your employer. And you want to do at least whatever that matching amount is. So if it's 2 or 3%, you start there. And every year, try to give yourself a raise, raising it up 1, 2, 3%, whatever you can do, where you're not going to feel it so much in the paycheck, and you can still keep saving and really start escalating those savings.
Yeah, with that emergency fund, one of the things that is an easy fix to that, or an easier fix, is when you're thinking the 3 to 6 months, is how much are you spending every single month? If you can limit that number down or bring it down by cutting out additional expenses, things that are the more wants than the needs, you can lower what that expense number is, and now the 3 to 6 months isn't as high. And as you build that up, now you can start adding some of that stuff back in there, because now you have that base in your budget, in your savings, to be able to expand. But right away, you're going, hey, I don't have an emergency fund, or it's really small, and if my car broke down, I couldn't fix it. Cutting down those initial expenses allows you to save that much faster.
Yeah, this is just so good, guys. I hope it's encouraging the people listening in, watching in. Debt. It's probably more of a reality than we hope to imagine.
Yeah.
I can't remember what they say is the national debt load of the common American. It's a really high number. Obviously, it's an average. So there's people on both sides of that spectrum. But so what is your practical advice to those who've got debt and how to tackle it?
Well, I would start with paying off the highest interest debt first. So credit cards usually are very high debt. So with the credit cards, you're talking anywhere from 0% all the way up to, I've seen it at 28%. And that is super high interest that is going to continue to snowball and make your debt just out of control. So what you want to do is start with the highest interest rate debt first and start to pay that off to really limit the damage on your debt load there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You can kind of categorize that debt in terms of interest rate, dollar amounts, and then kind of what is beneficial debt versus debt that is going to bring your credit score down, or that's going to make it harder just to meet your monthly bills. Like mortgage stuff, that's one that's kind of out there. Usually it's a low interest rate and it's going to be out there for a long time. Student loan is kind of that middle area between a lot of that. But then you've got cars, you've got credit cards, stuff like that. That's a little bit easier, where you need to attack it right away, or maybe you can make some changes in terms of what you're doing, or maybe the cars that you have. If maybe that debt level is too high.
Yeah, there's even some ways too that you can go about paying down your debt as well, like Matt was just mentioning with your mortgage. Sometimes if you have a ton of, say, credit card debt out there that has very high interest rate, you might want to go back and do what they call like a cash out refinance. So that way you can lock into really low interest rate debt, like he was talking about, maybe 2 or 3% versus something that you're paying, say, 20 on.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's great. And you actually ended up beating me to the punch on some of the sequencing of how, what do you target, because we've got people in our congregation who are, just starting their careers. So they've accumulated some student loan, which is pretty normal. And maybe they've got consumer debt, like credit card debt or cars. And now even they're thinking about buying houses and things like that. And they're like, what do I attack first? And so as I've heard you right, it's like, think about the one that has kind of the weightier cost and interest. Tackle those first, and the stuff that's going to be of a benefit long term, kind of leverage that with mortgage and things like that later. Yep. So that's just so awesome. As we talk about investing and, it's most people's goals to eventually retire, one of the questions that I hear all the time: explain the kinds of IRAs. There's two, and for us lay people, we're like, I don't know the difference. So inform us, enlighten us, please.
Yeah, well, there's two that I think you're talking about, which is a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA.
That's right.
So there are some other types of IRAs out there as well, but most of them would fall into the same category as a traditional IRA. So with a traditional IRA, that's what they call pre-tax dollars. Basically, you're putting money in with and getting either a tax deduction on it, so you're taking it in the current year as a tax deduction, okay? And then it's going to grow tax deferred, which basically means when you go to take the money out later on, you're going to be taxed on whatever you take out at your ordinary income tax rate. So whatever tax bracket you're in at that point is where you're going to pay the tax. With a Roth IRA, you're taking money that you've already been taxed on out of your, say, your paycheck or the bank account, wherever it's coming from, and you're putting money into that Roth IRA. So that's already after-tax monies is what they call it. Now those after-tax monies continue to then grow tax-free forever. So by the time you get to retirement, or age 59 and a half is where you can start taking out those monies. You will be able to go and take, say, if you put in 5,000, it grew to 50, you can go and take all 50,000 and pay no tax on it. Whereas in that IRA, if you put 5 in, it went to 50, you're going to pay tax on that 50,000 when you pull it out.
Yeah, it's a great explanation. That's the stuff where we're both certified financial planners, and that's the stuff that you kind of geek out on, in terms of what
For
the order
sure.
of you put
For
money
sure.
in, where do you take money out, and when do you take it. That's the stuff that, you're really looking where you can tweak stuff, when you're kind of really more established at that point. Some rules of thumb is usually when you're younger, your income is lower than it's going to be when you're older. That kind of makes sense. So when you're younger, a lot of people are going to max out Roth IRAs first. And then as you grow in your career, your salary starts to go up, you start bumping up tax brackets. If you do, that's where traditional IRAs become more impactful at that point. But for everybody, it's a little bit different. It's kind of one of those things where one person you're going to give an answer to, and then their neighbor you're going to give a different answer to, because they're in two different situations. But that's certainly the stuff where the math really gets involved in terms of, what's the best option for you.
Yeah, it's really going to come down to somebody's goals and objectives, like Matt was saying, and everybody's situation is so unique and so different that you basically either want to work with somebody like Matt or another type of investment professional out there, or seek out like Financial Peace. They do a good job of describing some of those things as well.
Yeah, another plug for Financial Peace. It's coming up here at Fox River, so if you're interested, we'll be able to get you the link if you contact us to register for that, as they mentioned, and I've been through it a number of times as well. It's really will help accelerate just thriving financially, so I want to plug that as often as we can. All right, so talking to young people who are dating, engaged, newlyweds, give us some practicals on merging or joining finances and, some things to consider when it comes to that.
Yeah, communication is key, and that whole part of your whole life, you're still getting to know that person, and you're still trying to figure out who they are and all of that. And when you're engaged, hopefully you have a pretty good idea of who that person is, and as you're getting married. But financials, like we talked about this weekend, is a really big trouble spot for a lot of marriages. So the earlier you talk about that and figure that out, the more beneficial you're going to be. I know for my wife and I, we joined our finances shortly before we got married. It just kind of really was easy for us to do so. But that didn't mean we weren't going to have arguments, we weren't going to have disagreements and all that stuff, but from an organization standpoint, it made sense. For other people, they wait till they get married, but you want to make sure that you're having those conversations and know where you're at. Anecdotally, I know someone who they were engaged and they're about to get married and found out that the person they're engaged to had thousands of dollars of gambling debt. And they didn't know that at the time. So thankfully they found it out before they did get married. But that's that conversation, knowing who that person is, what they're doing, what they're like. You want to make sure that you can figure some of that stuff out ahead of time.
Yeah, even if it's something small, I'll give you a pretty good example. When my wife and I first got married, I thought I was doing us a favor. We were going to open a joint savings account, and she had went out of town, and we were trying to connect on doing it. And I'm like, you know what? I'll just go set it up. I'll add her on the account. She can just pop in and sign. Well, that didn't go over so well. She wanted to be involved in the process, and that's what I would say is make sure you guys are on the same page. Make sure you're communicating. Make sure you're involving each other, because it is, definitely something that you want to be in good communication on. So, like Matt said, communicate and communicate more.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And a lot of, how you direct money is really going to be what is your end goal with it. So being on that same page and knowing what you want to do, it's kind of the same thing of, where are you going to send your kids? Where are you going to live? When do you want to retire? Where do you want to retire? All those big things, finances are what's going to get you to that, and making sure that you're saving for the right reason, you're both on the same page is going to make that go a lot smoother. Because if one person's saving for something and the other person doesn't want to do it, that's not going to work. And want to make sure that you have that right communication.
Right. And you want to set ground rules too for each other, whether it's an allowance like Matt mentioned over the weekend, or like in our marriage, we set a spending limit where like it's $100. If something's over $100, you got to pick up the phone and call and talk to each other and just make sure that it's okay that you're going to be able to purchase this.
Yeah, so those are both really excellent advice, on keeping the financial dialogue open and honest and sincere, and having like-minded goals and limits. And I've been able to hear this many times, and it's a bit of a practice even within our ministry here, is every dollar has a name, right? And that you pay yourself.
Yeah.
That's the whole idea of savings, and you honor God with your tithe, and then you live on a budget so that you aren't like always feeling overwhelmed and under stress, because I mean, you guys said it, it's a huge point of contention and conflict amongst couples. It's, number one or number two, depending on who you ask, as the conflicting thing. So give us some advice to the teens in our church and in our audience who are, they're just starting to get jobs, and, it's different than when you and I started working, where we got paper checks, we had to go to the bank. Now everything's so digital.
Yep.
So like, what are the practices to help them get, a healthy understanding of, budgeting and saving and money management?
Yeah, I think compared to that, I think they're probably in a great spot. So many more resources are available now than were before. Like you said, getting the paper check, having to go to the bank, that was a real thing. It was tangible. So I think that there was a benefit to that. But now, because everything is electronic, they can go on that bank app and see. And a lot of those apps will do some budget stuff for you too, and giving some information so you can see that. I know growing up, we had to give my parents, when we got paid, a certain amount of the money that we got in our paycheck. They put in an account, and that would be used for college later on. So I mean, some of those habits that's forced savings at that point too as well, that having some skin in the game also when I went to college, knowing that my money was going towards that too, was really, really impactful to me. But starting to learn that savings at that point in time, getting into those right habits of making sure that it's not, I got paid today, it's Friday, I'm going to go out with my friends and I'm going to spend all this money that I just made right away, which is, really the draw. I know I still have it today, so, making sure you don't fall into that.
Yeah, I mean, those are all great points, and whether you're young or you're old, you're going to have goals, you're going to have objectives, and you want to get those outlined so that way you know what you're saving for, and you're not just having money in the bank where you're like, yep, I got $1,000 in here, I can spend $1,000. Set time aside for yourself to develop those goals and objectives and for whatever you're going to save for. And if you're young and you have no expenses and you have the ability to set up a Roth IRA, I mean, that would be a fantastic place to start, because the time value or the compounding with the interest you get on your money is going to grow so much greater than if you start 10 years later.
Right, yeah.
And that's such a huge part of your life in terms of life changes, going through high school, going through college, graduating and stuff like that, being in the real world for the first time. I've got 2 nephews in college, and to hear them talking about, my apartment costs this much, and I've got to buy stuff for the kitchen, and I've got to buy furniture, all this stuff, just hearing their conversations is somewhat comical to me. As their process in their head is they just assumed, hey, I got this part-time job, I could have my own apartment. And I hear my brother go, yeah, rent's a little bit more than you're making, But hearing those conversations, it's really cluing it to me how I felt when I was that age too. But then also because our kids are younger, going, okay, I need to be ready for these conversations with them and start to show them how much things cost, and that how you actually have to spend money once you get it.
For sure. And if you're a parent, I'd say make sure you talk to your kids about finances. I mean, it starts at home for sure. I'm driving around in the car a lot, and I'll just shoot back to my kids, hey guys, are credit cards a good idea? And see what they say from like what they've learned from seeing mom and dad spend money, or what's a Roth IRA? We start talking about those things already, or why do you save your money? And the common answer right now is they want to go to college, but that's because that's what mom and dad tell them, right? So the one that's getting a little bit older is like, because I want a PS5, So there's different things that they're starting to save for and start to really recognize the value of a dollar, and that's what you really want to teach your kids is what is the value of a dollar versus, hey, I'm just getting this money and I'm just able to go out and spend it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think about what would I tell myself, my 20-year-old self or my 17-year-old self now in my 40s. So I want to ask that question to you guys. What would you tell your young self? I know you just referred to your children, but there's a bias there. You're a finance nerd, and so that kind of geeks you out and everything else. And maybe they'll take over the practice when you retire. I don't know. I'm just teasing. But for our people watching, what would you tell your younger self now that you've been journeying as many years as you have in this industry?
Yeah, I would probably say to start up a Roth IRA is exactly what I would tell myself, especially when I was young, because I didn't do that right away, and I wish I would have had 10 extra years to be able to do that, especially when I had no expenses because I was living at home when I was going to school. So that's the place that I would definitely start.
Yeah, I agree. It's the importance of saving and having structure in your finances earlier on, and not, actually probably even, to another extent of that is stop trying to keep up with everybody else.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially I didn't get married till about 6 or 7 years out of college, so I lived with roommates and friends and all that stuff for a while. And it was always, oh, you went and bought this? Well, you know what? That's a great idea. I want that too. Or why do we both need to have video game systems in the place? It's just stuff like that when you're younger, you're like, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. I'll go to the store with you. Stuff like that. Or even, oh, you bought that car? That is a really nice car. I should get a nicer car myself. Stuff like that where, exactly.
Yep.
And that thought process in our minds, is really natural. But earlier on, I wish I would have recognized that and made decisions, a little smarter than I did.
Yeah, and the other thing that I would say is, like, when my wife was in college, she had to take out loans. And I remember this question. She kept being like, how come all these people get to go on all these trips and I'm here, like, only, still back in Wisconsin in the middle of winter? And I'm like, because they're taking all the money and you're paying some of it back right away because you're recognizing that you don't need it all and you're keeping your loan balance down, whereas they're just using it to live on. And now there's a massive difference between her and a lot of her friends as to where her student loan balances are. So that's the other thing that I would say is only take what you need, especially if you're going out to get a loan or whatnot. Remember, you're paying interest on that, so you have to pay all that back and then some. So be responsible with it. Be fiscally responsible with your choices.
Yeah, and I'm just taking this in, and I'm like, this is better than free tips. This is like pro tip level stuff, and I've got a 20-year-old and an 18-year-old, and they're both applying for university at the exact same time, and I'm like, oh man, these are some of the things that, I'm like mentally penciling in my mind that I better be talking about this with my own kids. So, on behalf of my family, thank you. On behalf of the church family, thank you for this. And I wanna, make sure that we honor God with our time resource as well as our financial resources. And after hearing Pastor Guy speak about on Sunday thriving financially, what could be some of your summarizing, how to put God and our finances together comments?
I would just say going back to kind of what I said over the weekend, trusting God, pray to God. He hears you. He's definitely going to hear your prayers. And yeah, it totally stinks when it's not the answer that you don't want to hear, but you're going to get that direction. So just be able to lean into God. That's the best advice that I think you can take when it comes to your finances.
Yeah, to me, it's always goes back to generosity and knowing what's important. Dollars might get bigger, numbers might get bigger, especially as you get older and you're able to advance in a career. But if your heart isn't in the right place, if you're not giving back, and that level is dependent on, at least I believe in you and God and what's right. But if that's not the first thing in your mind and it's not important to you, that's I think where there's you're not connected in that way. So, and that was a real big thing for my wife and I. And at one point I thought, I'm like, okay, I really need to tithe, but it wasn't in my heart. It was just, I was told it. And so I was like, okay, I'm to the penny. I'm doing this. And it didn't feel right to me. And a little bit after that, it clicked. And I'm like, okay, it's not the specific number that's really important. And actually, my wife and I are past that point, but it just feels right. It's not we're doing it out of compulsion. We're doing it because we want to, and we're looking for opportunities to do it, and we're looking for ways to be able to help more in different situations. And that's always been something that, at least over the last few years, has been really impactful to us.
Yeah, I mean, when God gets a hold of your heart, He really gets it all, doesn't He? And there's such a reward and a sense of, just love, of appreciation of what God's given us that we're giving back to Him when it's not about to the penny and the mathematics, but it's like, wow, God has been so good, so kind, so gracious, and I'm going to give back. And it's like, it's not like even giving, returning back to what God has already blessed us with, and how it just, when that happens internally, it's like, man, I wish I started doing this a long time
Oh,
ago.
yeah. Yeah, I
Right?
agree. It's almost amazing looking back too and seeing a lot of that, because I think you see your own personal change through that process. But my wife and I had this conversation not that long ago. I said, because I do track everything to the penny, even though that's, is going back and going, hey, over the last 5 years, we were able to do this with God's help, but we're still here. And even though we did this, we're still here. And that's the amazing part to us is throughout all of that, we don't feel like we don't have what we gave away.
Right.
It's not something where we said, man, I wish I wouldn't have done that instead,
Yeah, fantastic. Well, guys, we're just so grateful for your willingness to serve our church and the viewers online with this just rock solid practical advice. And it's really our prayer here at Fox River that 22 would be a year of thriving in all the aspects of the componentry of life, including your finances, your faith. And so if you have opportunity or you missed some of these messages, you can go back to our website, foxriverchristian.org, and click on and listen to the sermons as well as the different interviews that have taken place over the last number of weeks. And we just thank you so much for joining us and look forward to gathering again this weekend. God bless you.